All right, so let's start off with our first big question. How are monopolies created? Um, First, let's understand what a monopoly is. It's a single firm, right? It's the only firm in the market, and it sells a product without any close substitutes. So the way that it's able to exist in such a fashion is that it's somehow able to prevent other firms, new firms, from entering the market. Okay? And so we can kind of measure how powerful the monopoly is using something called monopoly power, and it's basically a measurement of their ability to set the price of a good or service. So as it turns out, monopolies aren't the only ones with monopoly power. The other two types of firms we're going to look at later in the lecture also have a degree of monopoly power, but monopolies have the most monopoly power. Now, what is it that those are those things that can prevent new firms from entering? Well, we call those barriers to entry. So in contrast to competitive markets where entry and exit is free, basically there's really high costs to entry, and that's what these barriers are, these things that prevent new firms from entering the market. So in other words, there are restrictions that prevent new entry from other firms, from new firms. All right, so let's talk about some of these different types of barriers to entry. So one of them is simply control of resources. So you see the diamonds pictured here. De Beers, if you didn't know, basically has a monopoly on diamonds, and it's because they basically control something like 98% of the world's diamond mines. So they have a monopoly simply because they maintain control of all of the resources in mining for diamonds. Another barrier to entry is problems raising capital. So some firms, some businesses, some industries require a lot of money to get started. So this would include businesses like Georgia Power, Comcast, right? These industries that have huge upfront costs in terms of setting up an infrastructure through which they operate. So that's another barrier to entry is problems raising capital. Another one is called economies of scale, and this is also related to companies like Georgia Power and Comcast and other utilities, where basically once those firms do have the infrastructure set up and the upfront costs taken care of, the marginal cost of providing service to an additional customer is basically almost zero, and so their average total cost simply is always falling. We don't see the typical U-shaped average total cost curve like we have with the competitive firms that we saw earlier in the semester. So we'll see what that looks like later. But economies of scale is basically another natural barrier to entry. And this last one, economies of scale, we call these types of monopoly that enjoy this barrier natural monopolies. Okay, so and we'll talk about why that is. In addition to these natural barriers to entry, there are also government-created barriers. So those include licensing, patents, and copyrights. So licensing, things like medical licenses, right? You have to have a license to practice medicine. There's other types of licenses, radio frequency licenses, and things of that nature that the FTC has control over. Then, of course, patents and copyrights. These are other types of government-created barriers to entry. So, of course, you see Taylor Swift here. She's got copyrights to all her music, so she basically has a monopoly over her own music. And then you see pharmaceuticals here, some drugs. Same kind of thing. The pharmaceutical industry involves patents that protect the intellectual property of the development of these drugs. So these are government-created barriers. So just to be a little more specific about these things, licensing, these are basically exclusive rights to sell a good or service. Again, like a medical license. There may be pros and cons to providing these things, but the idea is that with things like medical licenses, you want to make sure there's a certain level of quality, and so that has to be proven and maintained. But of course, that means that there may be some monopoly power involved with these types of goods and services. So, and then same thing with patents and copyrights, right? The idea there is that if Taylor Swift didn't have a copyright to her music, what incentive would she have to create it in the first place if she couldn't have a copyright over it? If someone could easily steal it and profit off of her own music, what incentive would she have to make it in the first place? So, that's one pro to having copyrights, is that it incentivizes people like Taylor Swift to make music like this. Same thing with these drugs, right? What incentive would the pharmaceutical industry have if it developed a drug and very quickly and easily it was simply stolen from them and copied and duplicated? So the pros are that it provides the incentive to create these things of value, but then of course, again, the cons are that, well, to some degree it creates a monopoly power, which means that prices are higher, generally supply is lower, so problems associated with those things are the cons. All right, so just to recap, just to summarize the characteristics of a monopoly, there's one seller with a unique product that has no close substitutes. There's very high barriers to entry, basically making it impossible for competitors to enter the market. And what this leads to ultimately is it allows the monopoly to make its own price.